Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Senator Corker and I had the privilege of being in Chattanooga on Monday for the opening of Volkswagen's North American plant. It was a great day for our country. Here's a major manufacturer in the world making in the United States what it plans to sell in the United States, and we salute Volkswagen, and I salute Chattanooga and Tennessee. 1/3 of our auto manufacturing, of our manufacturing jobs in our state are auto jobs, and there was a new Volkswagen Passat that gets 43 miles a gallon. And that's good news for Americans who are paying $4 and more a gallon for gasoline. But as I was there at that celebration for these new fuel-efficient cars, and earlier this week at a hearing of the Energy Committee, I was thinking, what if I were to say to you, or to anyone I might see, while you're worrying about $4 gasoline, did you know that we have sitting over here unused enough fuel that is not oil to power 40% of our light cars and trucks at a lower cost? That's right. We have unused every night enough power to power 40% of our light cars and trucks every night. And we can do that by simply plugging them into the wall. I'm talking about electric cars and light trucks that almost every major manufacturer is now beginning to make. And we don't have to build one new power plant to do it. Last week, Senator Merkley and I appeared before the Energy Committee to talk about our legislation, the Promoting Electric Vehicles Act. I said to the committee the difference between the bill this year and the one the committee reported last year by a vote of 19-4, good bipartisan vote, is that this year the price of gasoline is higher than it was last year, and the cost of our bill this year is less than it was last year. Encouraging electric vehicles is an appropriate short-term role for the federal government. Our legislation establishes short-term incentives for the wide adoption of vehicles in 8 to 15 pilot communities. Our legislation advances battery research. The $1 billion that we saved by reducing the cost of last year's bill, we saved by avoiding duplication from other research programs. And finally, if you believe that the solution to $4 gasoline and high energy prices is finding more American energy and using less of it, as I do, electric cars and trucks are the best way to use less. Electrifying half our cars and trucks could reduce the use of our foreign oil by 1/3, saving money on how we fuel our transportation system and cutting into the billions of dollars we send overseas for foreign oil. So instead of making the speech for the rest of my time, let me tell a short story. It's the story of Ross Perot, the famous Texan, and how he made his money. Back in the 60s, he noticed that the big banks down in Dallas were locking their doors at 5 o'clock. And the banks had all these big computers in the back room, and they were locking them up too. They weren't using them at night. So Mr. Perot made a deal with the banks. Sell me your unused computer time at night, he said. And they did, at cheap rates. And then he went to the states and talked to the governors. This is before I was a governor. And he made a deal with the states to use that cheap computer time to manage Medicaid data. And he made $1 billion. In the same way, we have enormous amounts of unused electricity at night. A conservative estimate is that we have an amount of energy unused at night that's equal to the output of 65 to 70 nuclear power plants between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. I suspect that's the greatest unused resource in America. What if someone proposed building 60 or 65 nuclear power plants? Actually, I proposed building 100, but if we tried to build 60 or 65 more, it'd take us 30 or 40 years and cost us $500 billion if we could even do it. And what I just said was that we have an amount of unused electricity that's equal to the output of 60 to 65 nuclear power plants every night in this country between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And if we were to use that resource to plug in cars and trucks at night, we could electrify 43% of our cars and trucks without building one new power plant. It's a very ambitious goal to imagine electrifying half our cars and trucks. It'll take a long time to do it, but it's the best way to reduce our use of foreign oil. Another reason I think it will work is it's easy for consumers, and I am one. For 2 years, I drove a Toyota Prius, and it was modified to add an A123 battery. I increased my mileage to about 80 or 90 miles per gallon. And I just plugged it in at night at home. Very simple. I now have a Nissan Leaf. It's all electric. I have an apartment nearby here, the Capitol, and I just plug it in at night. I don't even have a charger. I just plug it into the wall. And I can drive it about 2 hours every day and plug it in at night. I haven't bought any gas since January, since I got my Leaf in Washington, D.C. And I've had no problems, either with the modified Toyota Prius that I drove for 2 years or the Nissan Leaf that I've driven now for about half a year. Almost every car company is making electric cars today or will soon have them on the market. So if extra electricity is available and electric vehicles are easy to use and car companies are making them, then why do we need for the government to be involved? That's a good question. For one thing, it's the urgency of the problem. $4 gasoline's killing our economy, throwing a big wet blanket over it, and the only solution is find more, use less, and this is the best way to use less. And to my Republican colleagues, I said before our committee, and I would say today, we've been saying for 3 years in our caucus, find more, use less. We've criticized Democrats for wanting to use less without really wanting to find more. And we're subject to the same criticism if we want to find more, which I think we should, offshore, on federal lands and in Alaska, and then we don't have a credible way to use less. Electric cars and trucks is the best way to use less. Another criticism is that it interferes with the marketplace, our bill. It does, but in a short-term and limited way. Short-term incentives for new technologies to jumpstart nuclear energy, to jumpstart natural gas truck fleets, to jumpstart electric cars and trucks in 4 to 5 years, I think are appropriate given the urgency of the problem. If I'm here in 5 years, I'll be the first to say that should be the end of it. If I'm not, I'll come back and argue for its repeal. And finally, conservative groups across the country have said national security demands that we do this. Gary Bauer, president of American Values, as well as Richard Land, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, endorsed our electric cars bill last year, saying that national security concerns overwhelm any opposition to it, and it's the best way to displace our use of oil. That was them talking. Can we afford it? Well, our proposal is $1 billion cheaper, and it's an authorization bill, and we should be setting priorities, and Senator Merkley and I have agreed that we won't try to pass the bill when it comes before unless we can agree to do it in a way that doesn't add to the debt. So in summary, Mr. President, I would say it's time to address $4 gasoline and high energy prices. To do that, we need to find more American energy offshore, on federal land, in Alaska, but we also need to use less. The single best way to use less is to jumpstart the use of electric cars and trucks. Electric cars and trucks, electricity just a delivery system. The fuel comes from a whole variety of things, natural gas, coal, and other things. So we jumpstart the use of that huge resource that we have just sitting there unused every single night. Our committee approved this bill once before. The problem is worse today than it was when they approved it last year. The bill costs less than it did when they approved it last year. It's an appropriate role for the federal government. We'll work to make sure that if this body were to pass it, that it doesn't increase the debt. I urge my colleagues to report the bill to the floor and to consider encouraging electric cars and trucks as the single best way to use less energy and reduce the use and reduce the cost of gasoline. I thank the senator from Alabama for his courtesy in listening to my remarks, and I yield the floor.